Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Institute for Government. It's nice to see you here. Welcome, congratulations for making it through the wind and rain. My name is Hannah White. I'm a programme director here at the Institute, and I lead the Institute's work on parliamentary scrutiny. And in relation to that, we've recently published, well, after the election, we published some work on the impact that select committees can have on government. We've since then been working with committees, including Sarah's committee and Stephen's committee, to help them think about the impact that they can have. And we've also recently launched a new piece of work which is looking at parliamentary scrutiny of the EU. Now, I've got some housekeeping things I have to do. There is no fire alarm planned, so should the fire alarm sound, please follow instructions given by the fire wardens and leave the way you came in, basically, and the assembly point is by the statue outside of George VI. Please do not attempt to tackle the fire or or retrieve your personal belongings before you leave. The toilets, there is one toilet on this floor. There was one toilet under the disabled access toilet under the stairs, and the main toilets are on the lower ground floor. And that is the housekeeping. So, this event is the Institute's contribution to Parliament Week, which, as you all probably know, is the annual series of events which attempts to stimulate engagement with and knowledge of our democratic institutions. And today we're lucky enough to have a great panel of new select committee chairs, some slightly newer than others, who are going to answer some questions we've had in advance sent in, which Mark Darcy is going to put to them. But we're also going to be taking questions from the floor, so do be thinking, and we'll do that as we go along. So don't feel that you have to wait for the end if you have a question arising from something that's been said. We will be live tweeting the event, and all the hashtags are on the slide here, so I'd encourage you to join in with that. And I think with that, I will hand over to Mark Darcy from the BBC, who's very kindly chairing.
Thanks very much indeed, Hannah. I was explaining to my wife what I was going to be doing this evening, chairing a seminar on select committees, and she said to me, please tell me you're really having an affair. But I think we're actually in for a very interesting evening. This evening we have three titans of the select committee corridor with us today. We have Stephen Twigg, who chairs the International Development Committee. We have Sarah Williston, who is the senior select committee chairman here present this evening on the basis of winning a by-election quite late in the last Parliament, who chairs the Health Committee, and we have Pete Wishart, who chairs the Scottish Affairs Select Committee. So what I'm proposing to do is just invite each of the guests in turn to talk for a few minutes, just 2 or 3 minutes, about what their committee's agenda is, what they hope to achieve in the 5 years of their committee's life cycle, and then get on to the serious business of asking impertinent questions. So, first of all, Stephen, tell us, what's the agenda for the International Development Committee? What do you think success looks like in 5 years' time?
Thanks, Mark, and good evening, everyone, and thanks for being here. I might put on record, I think perhaps on behalf of all of us, the fantastic support we get from the Institute for Government for the work of the select committees. I thought I'd make one observation about the International Development Committee and then answer the question, if that's okay. International Development Committee is perhaps unique in that the core work of the department that we monitor is actually supported by all the major political parties, because at its heart is the commitment to 0.7% international aid, but it is hugely controversial out there with the public and the media. And so in our work, we both have to challenge and scrutinise, which is the proper role of any select committee, but also bear in mind that we actually have in common with the government a desire to defend and persuade on that core issue of 0.7%. And that is perhaps different to any other committee working in the House of Commons. Our agenda for this Parliament was really set for us in New York in September, when the United Nations adopted the Sustainable Development Goals, which is the updating of the Millennium Development Goals, how we best tackle extreme poverty, inequality, unemployment, poor education, poor health in all parts of the world. And we've decided as a committee for this Parliament that will be the common thread that runs through all of our work. Within it we'll have priorities. Jobs and livelihoods will be a priority for us. Violence against women and girls and gender equality will be a priority for us. Good governance will be a priority, and education. And those will be issues that we'll focus on both in our country-based inquiries and our thematic inquiries. And finally, right now, we're having an inquiry into the Syrian refugee crisis, where DFID, alongside other government departments, has such a big role to play in addressing what is such a major current crisis.
And what does success look like in 5 years' time? What would you hope to have achieved?
Well, I think partly because of the first part of my answer to your question that you hadn't asked me, success is partly persuading the public that actually the 0.7% commitment is the right commitment for us to have. But I think success in terms of the government and our role scrutinising the government is to ensure that the aid that is being spent is spent effectively and has a real impact in alleviating extreme poverty, and in particular reaching people in the poorest countries in the world.
Thanks, Stephen. Sarah Williston.
Thank you. Well, first of all, can I just echo those comments about the Institute for Government and the help that Hannah has given to support our committee, and also just to point out that the committee members, there's a much wider committee team, and also to thank Hugh Yardley, who's in the audience, who's our committee clerk, because there's an extraordinary amount of work that goes on supporting committees within Parliament itself. And what we decided to do was think about what our overarching theme should be, that how we can influence and shape if you like, a more positive future for the NHS, but underpinning that, not to lose sight of the patient's perspective and the patient's experience. And we felt there were a number of key themes and challenges over the next 4 or 5 years now. Those around, obviously, the financial challenge, which underpins all of this, but also themes like how we actually manage demand and the issue of prevention with the NHS. So looking at our the inquiry we've just finished is one on how can we influence the shape of the future government's childhood obesity strategy. So we wanted to take evidence across those themes and contribute to that debate. So that's part one strand of our work, but I'd say many future themes will be around how we actually get health and social care working more effectively together and get the very best for patients from a limited resource. And so that's going to be a key challenge alongside all the other roles that go with select committees around accountability. That's to say, sometimes examining an important issue of public concern that may arise. In the last Parliament, that, for example, we held a one-off hearing around the time of the Ebola crisis, that kind of thing, as well as those accountability hearings we hold with the army of regulators in the NHS and bodies like NHS England, the CQC and so forth. And then there are other roles that we have to do, for example, with post-legislative scrutiny. But as a committee, we vote on our inquiries. We have, I'd say, we've just started finished one inquiry into what should be in the childhood obesity strategy. Now we're taking hearings around primary care, which fits with our theme about the NHS workforce. And then from there, we'll be holding an inquiry into public health. And then from there, looking at the government spending review and the implications of that for health and social care. So that's our current programme.
Will you count the committee's 5 years a failure if you don't have a sugar tax at the end of that?
Well, the inquiry publishes on the 30th, so I can't possibly comment.
Well, yeah. Pete Wishart.
Thank you, and good evening, everybody. It's really great to be back here at the Institute of Government. And can I also echo the remarks from my fellow panellists about being here and the work that this institution does in supporting the select committees. I'm the first Scottish National Party member who became a select committee chair. And if somebody had told me that 15 years ago when I first became a member of Parliament that I would be ending up chairing such an august committee, I would never have believed them. I would never have believed them if somebody told me that a year ago that we'd end up in this situation. But it's absolutely fantastic, so I'm very much really enjoying the new experience, and I think the Scottish National Party welcome the opportunity in this new Parliament to have two chairs, because it's not just myself as chair. We've got Angus McNeill, who's chairing the Energy and Climate Change Committee. I thought it was important when I became the chair that we'd have a recalibration of the committee's work, because it got itself into a bit of a situation, shall we say. I'll leave it hanging there, where the Select Committee, Scottish Affairs Select Committee, seemed to support one side in the referendum campaign. So we took the very unusual step of going to Scotland and asking Civic Scotland representative bodies and individuals what they wanted from the new Scottish Affairs Select Committee. And on Monday I had the great pleasure of publishing a report which suggested a number of things that they wanted to take up, which will be the theme of the work as we go forward. And there was a number of things that was said to us, like primarily amongst them being that they wanted to see the committee meeting much more regularly in Scotland, which we've now given a commitment to do. There was some stuff that we were quite surprised that emerged, things like immigration issues, which we found was quite important. There was things obviously to do with further devolution, particularly with the new powers that we're getting through the Scotland Bill on welfare and on fiscal issues. So we decided that we'd take up the fiscal framework, which is the underpinning of all the new powers, particularly to do with welfare and to do with taxation. So these are the sort of things that we're doing, and we wanted to make an early start and get up and going. So as a committee, we decided we'd do a report and inquiry into the creative industries in Scotland. Again, something that works across parliaments with our colleagues in the Scottish Parliament. So that was what we were doing, and that report took its last evidence session today, so that will be shaped up. But we're really in the hands of Scotland. Because we took the bother to ask them what they wanted, I think it would be almost rude not to oblige them by taking up the themes that they've offered us. So these are the sort of things that we're going forward. Maybe just to end too, that another issue that came out and that we're seriously considering and looking how this could be achieved is working in partnership with our colleagues in the Scottish Parliament. We're an unusual committee that, like we've got a Scottish Parliament, but there's still very many significant reserved powers. And there's now, particularly with the new devolved responsibilities, a much more of an arrangement where there's a certain sense that some of this is devolved and some of this is reserved, and these are the sort of things that we'll want to explore as this Parliament develops. But I think we've got a really good input from the people of Scotland, from Civic Scotland and representative bodies, so we've got a very full agenda as we go forward.
Well, thanks very much indeed for that, Pete. I'm going to start putting a few of the questions that have come through to us from various sources in a moment, but just before I move on to that, I think it'd be a pity just to sort of read out the questions and mechanically move down the list. So if people have follow-ups to particular questions as we go along, please do stick your hands up and I will try and take as many of those as I can. And exerting sort of quizmaster's privilege here, I'd like to start with one of my own. Pete, you're the only one of our three guests today who was here at the moment of, dare I say, the moment of interruption between the old style select committee setup and the right reforms kicking in the join between the 2005 and the 2010 parliaments. So I just thought I'd ask you a little bit about how different did the system seem to you after as compared to before?
Well, it's funny because when the Right Committee published its proposals and we got into the new environment, we had massive issues and difficulties with that because as a group of six, we found ourselves almost excluded from membership of select committees because the bar went higher because committees were smaller in securing membership. But now that we're the third party in Parliament and we've now got access to all the select committees, our view about these arrangements have sort of been changed, and I think what the right proposals actually do is allow for much more detailed work by select committees. I think because select committees are smaller, there could be more of a focus, particularly in the evidence acquiring sessions where there's a much more opportunity for detailed questioning. And I just think that the election of select committee chairs was a great innovation, which I think at that moment the respect for select committees and the authority that they had in the House was increased exponentially. And I think out of all the things that was secured through the election of select committee chairs is the one most significant feature that's made a real profound difference to the way that select committees do the work and the way they're observed by not just parliamentarians, but I think by increasing numbers in members of the public.
Stephen, you had a little bit of a commercial break over the period in which the right reforms kicked in.
Not entirely voluntary, yeah.
I wasn't going to be indelicate about it, but what is your impression? Because it must have seemed like a very abrupt change to you coming back and seeing the new style system in operation.
Well, first of all, I think Pete's absolutely right. The key change has been the election of chairs, and I suppose three of us who've won elections are more likely to look favourably on such a system. But my first job in government in 2001 was as Robin Cook's deputy, when the government decided, when Robin became leader of the House of Commons, when the government decided that they wanted to remove Gwyneth Dunwoody and Donald Anderson from committee chairs, and it was seen as a matter for the whips, really, rather than a matter for the House. And actually the motion got amended and the government didn't get its way, but it was a completely and utterly unsatisfactory system where effectively the whips were making decisions about who was going to chair select committees. So really to endorse what Pete said, that the election is the key change, and I think it does make for a more open and transparent system.
Sarah Woodson, do you think that the system's kind of caught up with the way select committees operate now, or do you occasionally find people saying, hang on a minute, shouldn't you just be doing what you're told, in so many words at least?
Yes, I think you have to be fairly robust in your approach, but I think that that's now stopped to a certain extent. I don't feel that pressure anymore.
That's interesting. And when you say there's a bit of pressure, what sort of things?
No, what I mean is, of course, the assumption is that you'd want to be helpful. But actually, I think the point should be that you should want to be constructive. And there's a difference between the two, that you are there to work constructively, but also sometimes to actually stand up and say some things that the government might find uncomfortable. So, you know, it's a fine balance, isn't it, between finding that route, where if you're seen as too obstructive, people are less likely to engage with you. So how can you most influence the process? And I think it is important that you're not seen to be a body that is constantly and deliberately obstructive, but how can you work to sort of shape and influence? I think that's an important path.
Well, let's pick up the point about influence here, because one of the questions I have here is, should select committees be pressing for major policy changes? And there have been quite a number of incidences of select committees doing just that. The Justice Committee in the last Parliament was urging a considerable rebalancing of justice spending away from prisons. The Home Affairs Committee wanted a strong investigation into some sort of decriminalisation strategy around drug use. More recently and very topically, we've seen the Foreign Affairs Select Committee laying out a whole series of criteria against which any military intervention in Syria should be joined. So there does seem to be, and perhaps Pete, you can take a look at this first, a much more muscular approach by select committees. Can they actually change policy though?
I think it's as a result of the post-right innovations that there is a bigger policy role for select committees now, and it's quite surprising how often they're now referenced by ministers, and Prime Minister particularly, as you mentioned, with the foreign affairs agenda when it comes to military action. And I think that this is part of what we're seeing with select committees in its new role within the House, its evolving role. Because I think the critical thing with select committees, I don't think we're finished and concluded yet by the changes and the innovations that's going through this. We now are happy with the structures and the way that it actually takes up really important issues in the House, but there is increasingly an expectation that we will delve into policy. And I think it's useful that we could do that because, again, we're in a very useful position where we can ask for direct evidence and secure these reports and inquiries that can help shape policy, can help shape legislation. So I think this is an increasing feature that we're going to see in the select committees as we go forward.
It's very consensual, this panel. I agree with that. I don't think you can do effective scrutiny and accountability without getting into policy. And of course, Pete and I both have the discipline that we have a Conservative majority on our committee, so we have to persuade government backbenchers if we wanted to propose something that would be a different policy to that of the government. But I think it's definitely part of the role of a select committee is to help to shape the policy terrain.
And is the convention of ministerial responsibility still relevant? This is a question from John Newman, a politics teacher. Are there examples of select committee scrutiny leading to a ministerial resignation in recent experience, and would that even be a desirable thing were it to happen? Who would like that one, sir?
Well, not in the experience of the Health Committee, but I think what they can do is they can challenge ministers and at times make ministers change policy and change the direction of policy. So I would say during the passage of the Health and Social Care Act, for example, the Select Committee during that process made a number of recommendations and raised a number of concerns, and I think we did help to shape and influence the direction. Clearly it remains with the government and the Secretary of State as to what's in the final bill, but I think that the select committees do definitely have a role increasingly in shaping and voicing the concerns.
And particularly perhaps in a hung parliament or a parliament with a relatively narrow government majority, are you sort of validators for government policy or not, as the case may be, when some proposal comes up? Is it something the ministers want to be able to sort of, almost as if brandishing a crucifix, say this has been endorsed by the select committee?
I think sometimes they can help a government, if you like, to introduce policies that they would like to be able to do and need a little bit more backing to be able to do.
Well, it's funny, I was watching the Thick of It episode where the fictional Hugh Abbott appears in front of a select committee, is probably a little bit generous with the truth and is dragged back the next day. And this is, I think that this is the approach that some ministers have. I don't know, I would characterise it as enjoying being in front of select committees, but they could also recognise the value of a good appearance in front of a select committee and helping shape an agenda, particularly in policy areas in their department. So I think that there's a real tension and interesting arrangement between the select committee and its relevant ministers, which is, like now the subject of sitcoms and stuff. So it's a really interesting thing, and I think that, like ministers who perform well in select committees could take quite a lot out of that. And as Sarah's right, it can help if they've got difficulty in a department, for example, and they want to push forward something that's maybe been log jammed by civil servants. They've got a select committee report in their back pocket that they could bring out and say, like, this is what we've found and this is what the evidence of the relevant select committee is determined, and let's go with it.
Stephen, you're nodding sagely.
Yeah, I'm nodding partly because I'm in an unusual position. I'm a gamekeeper turned poacher, having been on the front bench. And the example that came to mind when I was an education minister and the issue of school meals was moving up the political and media agenda. And I remember one of the most difficult sessions I did was before, not the Education Select Committee, I think it must have been Environment Select Committee, where I was really grilled on this and frankly didn't perform very well and went back to the department, and I think that had the effect of making us address an issue that we weren't addressing very well. To be honest, Jamie Oliver had a slightly bigger impact, but I think the Select Committee certainly had a bit of an impact in terms of the prioritisation the government gave it at the time.
Well, I've got a question here from Professor Anthony King. In chairing your committee, how do you strike a balance between the desirability of tackling important issues which may be contentious, and I assume that includes party political contentious, and how, if something like that comes up, how do you keep your committee's cohesion? Can it be dangerous to go for something that's too far close to the edge of party political controversy, and do you therefore perhaps occasionally shy away from such subjects? Sarah?
Well, of course, the closer you get to an election, the more difficult it is to maintain that cohesion, and certainly at the end of the last Parliament that was indeed the case. Having trying to hold an inquiry into public expenditure very close to an election, it does become more difficult to achieve that consensus. So I think that probably my advice to any select committee chair in the 6 months before an election is to try and actually choose something where you can still make some constructive policy suggestions with a view to the next Parliament, but to try not to tackle something that's very party political, because select committees work far better when members can leave their politics at the door and actually look at this from another angle.
Is it something to absolutely avoid, is a couple of members of your committee coming up with a minority report or something like that? Does that destroy the effectiveness altogether?
No, but I think what it does, it makes it very difficult for you to work effectively as a team and to produce consensus. And I think it's a very important role for select committees. And it doesn't mean to say that your inquiries are meaningless towards the end. I mean, we held an inquiry into end-of-life care, which will still be following up in this Parliament, and likewise some of the recommendations we made about diet and physical activity and health. And so that doesn't mean to say what you're doing is worthless, but I think one has to be realistic that very political issues very near an election are probably best avoided.
Pete, one assumes that there's a whole series of slightly skewed versions of these issues coming up in the Scottish Affairs Committee, where the party balance reflects, of course, the Commons more than it does the election result in Scotland.
We've got a very curious committee, and I think it's the only committee in the House that hasn't got a government majority. There's actually only four members from the Conservative Party in the Scottish Affairs Committee out of the 11, but there's only 4 Scottish members too, which again makes it a bit curious in terms of our membership. And it's the first time ever that the Scottish Affairs Committee has never had a majority of Scottish members. So we've got a very curious task of trying to make sure that all the different parties are happy, contented and satisfied with the work that we're undertaking. So when it comes to political issues, I think we've got to tread very carefully, because there's no party that's got the upper hand at all, and the balance has to be taken with you when we're looking at things. So I think for us, more than probably any other committee, we're particularly conscious of the hot political issues and doing what we can to make sure that people are brought with us. And I think as a committee, I didn't know how it was all going to work out, being a new committee chair myself, but I think that we managed to make that work. And I think Sarah's absolutely right. You've got to take the committee with you. I don't think any committee chair wants to spend a good part of their session getting into conflict with members of their committee, and you do go that extra mile to make sure that most as much as possible are accommodated, and you can go, because if you get minority reports or whatever like that, it's just about the worst possible thing, and I think everybody does all they can to ensure that's avoided.
Stephen, I suppose the serpent of party controversy doesn't enter the consensual Eden of the International Development Committee that often.
Not yet, but it's interesting because the Conservative Party, I think it would be fair to say there's a range of views on the 0.7%. So although it is the government's policy and the Conservative members of the Select Committee do all subscribe to it, I think we'd be in a different position had Conservative MPs elected some members to the International Development Committee who took a very contrary view on that. We're currently, as I mentioned, undertaking an inquiry on the Syrian refugee crisis, and there are potentially some issues where there might be differences between the parties, but my view is exactly the same as Pete and Sarah on this. I want to get consensus and I want to get a unanimous report.
And we have a question from the floor, if we could have the microphone over here, please. This gentleman here. Sir.
Hi, it's a question for Peter. I just wondered, after the election, when to all of our surprises Scotland's become virtually a one-party state, and there's only one chamber in the Scottish Parliament, if when you went back to Scotland to ask people for issues for the committee to take up, in fact, perhaps they were expecting more from you because of this?
More from the committee?
More from this? Committee.
Well, it's quite interesting. When we were quite surprised at the amount of submissions we had when we called for evidence about the work of the committee, and we were surprised with some of the themes and issues that started to emerge. But I don't think we'll ever get to a situation where the Scottish Affairs Committee is ever going to see some sort of scrutinising role for the Scottish Parliament. In fact, we're trying to do as much as we possibly can to ensure that we retain our core function, which is to scrutinise the work of the Scotland Office and look at reserved issues as the impact on Scotland. The Scottish Parliament's got its own committees, and in terms of scrutiny, that's where the Scottish Parliament does most of its work. They are significantly different from Westminster Select Committees in the way they work and hold government to account. So our job is very much like what it says in the tin, like with the Scottish Affairs Committee, there to scrutinise the work of the Scotland Office and look at the reserved issues as they come through. But we are evolving again a relationship with the Scottish Parliament, and what we're finding is that there's much more collaborative work that we can do, and that's something that we're really keen to explore. And I think in the next year we're going to be looking at a number of joint working arrangements with them, which I think and hope will be useful.
Which brings us neatly onto the issue of, our committee's going to be a bit more innovative in this Parliament. Are you going to find new ways of doing inquiries? There's already a bit of a vogue for kind of joint inquiries. The Education Committee and the Business Innovation and Science Committee are holding a joint inquiry into the issue of productivity, which they kicked off with a conference recently. We've seen other attempts to innovate in the past, so are people going to let 1,000 flowers bloom?
I think joint inquiries are useful. I mean, we're about to hold a joint pre-appointment hearing with the EFRA committee, for example, on the Food Standards Agency. We'd like to hold a joint inquiry at some point in the future with the Education Committee to follow up the work that we did in the last Parliament around children and adolescent mental health services. So I think actually trying to, but if we're asking government to work across government departments, we should probably do the same across select committees as well. But for that, we'd probably need to change the rules, because currently you need to have a quorum from both committees. And one thing you find doesn't work so well is if you have vast select committees. So I think the changes to make select committees smaller was a positive thing. So I hope we'll see that.
Can I just say, when I became a chair, I was quite keen to explore different ways of working and doing things. And like the traditional method and means of concluding a select committee report is to have the green published paper, and that's it. So we've been looking at other ways that there's maybe other things that we could do in terms of presenting a report, and I think we're the first select committee that's got a Facebook page, and we're very active on social media, and we make sure that messages are put out. We even had a hashtag for an inquiry today at hashtag Creative Scot. So, these are the sort of things that we're looking to embrace as a committee, and I think there's great opportunities for that, and there's other new ways to communicate with people who are interested and to try and make them less dry and sterile, the work of a select committee. There must be interesting, different, creative, innovative ways that we could bring people with us and engage them, and that's certainly that our committee is keen to look at as we go forward.
I think there's enormous potential to use social media a lot more. I can't pretend it's a personal strength, but we are looking as a committee at how we can use social media more effectively. Our refugees inquiry, we've been using a lot of social media, video, Twitter and so forth, and trying to reach an additional audience to the one that might normally follow our select committee or any other select committee.
Most select committee reports, when they emerge, if they get debated in Parliament at all, they're frequently rather low-key Westminster Hall affairs, populated mainly by members of the select committee talking about their own report. My bête noire used to be the annual Public Accounts Committee debate in the floor of the House, which was members of the Public Accounts Committee talking about the work of the Public Accounts Committee, and there didn't seem to be an engagement with the sort of wider House. Is there anything that can be done about that?
There is a change. If you take, for example, the inquiry we held recently into the childhood obesity strategy, we were asked as part of that by the Petitions Committee to respond to the e-petition that Jamie Oliver and Sustain had raised, which had over 140,000 signatures at the time. And I think the advantage of Parliament's response to an e-petition being through a select committee is that those who have actually raised the petition can actually come and contribute to it and give evidence directly, and I thought that was a very positive way of responding to it. And then when we do report, we're hoping to publish on the 30th. On the day of publication, the Petitions Committee are going to hold a debate on the petition to coincide with the publication of the report. And again, there'll be an opportunity for Jamie Oliver and Sustain to come to Parliament just before that debate and talk about their petition and what they think about our inquiry. And as I say, unfortunately, I can't discuss that because it's being published on the 30th. But I think the point is that may actually help to both give those who are launching petitions a real sense that Parliament's taking them seriously. Because otherwise I think there's a danger that e-petitions can kind of just become meaningless, rather like early day motions, although some people would disagree with me on that. But I think we'd like to see something that can genuinely take over, in my view, from early day motions and be meaningful.
Any further take? I thought I saw a hand flicker for a moment. Did I? No. Peter Riddle at the back.
Could I just raise one thing? I think it applies much more to Sarah's committee and Stephen's committee than Pete's. Of capture by the interest groups in the area you're covering. I mean, I can see particularly there's a very vocal lot of pressure groups in the international development area, and there are, health is much more diverse of competing ones. But the sense, thinking back to your days as a minister, Stephen, which you would regard the select committee as a spokesman for the interest groups in the area, and the need to be critical of them and detached from them some of the time.
I think I'd answer that in two halves, because I think there is a particular set of groups in international development, and it kind of relates to the point that I raised right at the beginning about this tension, getting the balance right between our proper role of scrutiny and accountability, but the cold reality of public discourse on development in this country, where there is a sizable body of people who don't agree with the amount of money that's being spent and the priority that it's given. So in the same way that might mean we approach government in a slightly different way to other select committees, it probably does mean we have a slightly different relationship with some of those NGOs, because overwhelmingly what they are doing is assisting making an argument out there with the public, And frankly, they're probably more likely to persuade the public than we are, let alone the government. So I think there is a perhaps unique situation there with regards to NGOs. My sense, and it is early days, I've obviously only been in the role since July, my sense is that there is a desire in the committee for us to hold everyone to account, so holding government to account, but if some of the lobby groups and NGOs are themselves recipients of support from government or multilateral agencies, they should be held to account too. So I hope that we will avoid that risk. I think my experience as a minister in education was, to be fair, probably quite different. And I would actually say I used to find going before the Education Select Committee the most challenging part of my role as being a minister, much more so than the Chamber of the House or even media appearances. I don't know if it was about Barry Shearman and his style of chairing the committee, but I was set aside a lot of time to prepare to go before the committee, and I used to find it an incredibly helpful experience in the sense that inevitably as a junior minister you have a whole list of responsibilities, but you focus on a smaller number of them day to day, and it would force me to get myself up to speed on the ones that perhaps we hadn't given the priority to, as in the previous answer, school meals was the case in that period.
Sarah, interest group capture?
I think you have to guard against it, and I also think that committee chairs shouldn't have any financial conflict of interest. I know that was an issue in the last Parliament, but I think if we're going to maintain the trust of the public, we have to be absolutely clear that that isn't going to be an issue. And I think, furthermore, you'd say just to be aware that that's always a possibility, be that these groups taking you out for supper or what have you. I mean, you just have to be mindful of it. And you know, and if you're aware that that's a possibility, it's less likely to happen.
But are you, for example, wary of being swept along by a celebrity-led campaign on an issue, naming no particular chef?
Is he in the audience?
I don't believe so.
I think there has been an accusation for select committees in the past that you can do a bit of grandstanding and go for the celebrity. I think, as I say, the reason that we invited Jamie Oliver was because we were specifically asked for us to be the vehicle for a response to an e-petition. And as it happens, he was an excellent witness. I mean, there are some people who have great expertise but can make terrible witnesses to inquiries because they aren't necessarily effective communicators, even if they are have extraordinary expertise. And I think the thing about some witnesses from, if you like, from that celebrity sector is that they can be very powerful communicators, and I say there's nothing wrong with that.
And Peter, is there a similar issue for your committee that's perhaps just not entirely visible from Westminster?
Well, what I'm going to have to do, I think, is get some celebrity witnesses, I think, to get this attention. But I think that the point with this is we all want to be in the news in our select committees, and we had a report released this week, and I was thrilled to bits that we got such widespread media coverage. And you know, it's what we do. We want to be noticed. We want to get that attention. So it's absolutely quite right that you do what you can to try and ensure that. And if you do something like what Sarah's doing in the health committee, and all of a sudden is getting noticed because there is a celebrity endorsement or somebody involved that has got the respect and attention of the public, that's a good thing because it helps to get that promoted. And in the end of the day, I think anything that we do, like we all believe in what we do in select committees, we all think that each of our reports is just about the best thing that's ever been produced by a select committee any time in the House, and we want to make sure that it's picked up, looked at and read as widely as possible.
I suppose the other thing in answer to Peter's question is about the quality of the specialist advice we get. And certainly we have 2 specialist advisors for our committee, and I think their advice is invaluable in protecting us from the sort of risk that Peter was referring to.
We have a question from the floor here.
Yes, Hartley Miller. Just embroidering a little bit on that point, do the panel think that the select committees have sufficient scope for initiating original research as opposed to hearing from people who have already formed an opinion? So it does give, the impression that I get is that an awful lot of what happens in the select committees is actually things being brought forward which somebody else has researched, but not actually something which is original research commissioned by the select committee. And I think there's a related question here, which is what do you see as being the relationship between your work and the National Audit Office, the Major Projects Authority, Office of Budget Responsibility, and all these other groups who have an interest in commenting on what government is doing?
Who would like to take that one?
Well, I mean, I think that's a very important point. And the trouble with commissioning original research can sometimes be the time lag involved. I mean, if you're going to initiate research in the field of healthcare, you may be looking some time hence. And so you don't want bad research, that doesn't help anyone. But what you can do is make recommendations about what research should be commissioned through the proper channels. But to answer your point about the NAO, we meet with the NAO and we will discuss the kinds of areas we would like them perhaps to provide us with evidence. And so that's something they do. So yes, select committees do have to work closely with those bodies.
I agree with what Sarah said about research in the specific sense of research, but I think advice, and I think all of us get plenty of advice, but being able to commission our own advice is really important. So I referred to the sort of specialist advisors who work with us, but also I'm very impressed with the secretariat that we've got as a committee to support our work, including committee specialists, and their support is really important. But I don't think that's research in the pure sense. And on the second part of your question, as well as the NAO, we have, again, a unique arrangement where we have the Independent Committee on Aid Impact that works directly for our committee and looks into areas of spending by DFID. And again, as I say, it's early days, but I think that will be invaluable in helping us as we look at the landscape after the spending review and the different reviews that DFID will then conduct.
And I think there's another point as well that select committees have a role in, that is persuading government to publish their own research. I mean, we recently pressed, for example, to have an evidence review published. Well, that's an evidence review paid for by the public, clearly in the public interest for it to be published. And so I think the select committees can actually press for things to be released in those circumstances that otherwise would be released at a time that's convenient for the government, but not necessarily possible then for the public to scrutinise it.
We've not got the same sort of relationship in Scottish Affairs with the NEO and some of these other external bodies that my colleagues do here. But the one thing that surprised me is just the sheer range and ability that we have in terms of staff to support us. I mean, I had no great expectation about being a select committee chair, you know, when you're a member of a party with 6 members of parliament, and all of a sudden you found you had this fantastic, and my chief clerk's with us this evening, and you've got this access to these fantastic members of staff. And I would actually struggle to think why we would want to do any detailed research of our own, because that expertise exists there. And I was, again, knocked out and surprised that you get so much staff devoted to your select committee to pick up this work. And some of the background briefings that we get and the assistance with the questions is quite formidable, and I think is more than enough for us to be getting on with and working with.
Well, I've got a question here, spookily enough, from Simon Briscoe, an ex-part-time advisor to a committee. Doesn't say which one on my list here, but it says, can committees do their job properly if they're so under-resourced? That doesn't sound as if you buy into that as an assumption.
You know, I mean, what I found is a new select committee chair, is the resource issues seem to be there, and I think it does allow us to do the work that we are undertaking. And there is that capacity. I mean, if we wanted to have external advisors and other means of support, that will be there for us to pick up. So I don't get a sense at all that we're under-resourced, and I mean, I'm genuinely surprised at the range of resources that's available to us.
I second that. Exactly the same experience. I'm so pleased with the support that we get for the committee.
The one area I would say that we could do with more support probably is in actually dealing with the volume of correspondence now that committees receive. But I think that's an issue for all MPs. That what emails has done is sort of opened up a vast increase in correspondence, and it would be, I think, nice to have more support perhaps to actually keep that. Is that something that you
maybe get more? I haven't spotted that as an issue so far.
Yes.
But in health you may get a lot more than I do.
We have a question from the floor.
Hi, I'm Nicola. I work here, so cheating slightly. So you've spoken about support, but I was wondering about your skills and experience as chairs and what you think makes an effective chair, and in particular how your experience in politics or elsewhere in your careers has helped you prepare to be a good chair, and how much sort of subject knowledge you think you need to chair effectively.
Who would like to take that one?
I said before I'm the gamekeeper turned poacher, and it was interesting during the election. For some colleagues that was a strength, and for some it certainly wasn't. I mean, one MP said, I would never vote for a former minister to chair a select committee, so not a lot I can do about that, but others felt the experience was helpful. And I certainly feel, although I was a minister in a completely different department, having a bit of a sense of how government works is helpful for me in chairing the select committee. So I'd say that's something that I have brought to the role. I feel in terms of the content, there's a lot of learning on the job, and that's why the support that we get both from committee specialists, the staff of the committee and others is so absolutely vital. How we do the job, I mean, I think a lot of it is about our personalities and how effective we can be in actually drawing on all of the talents of the people who are on the team and on the committee, and therefore I'm probably not the right person to ask. You probably need to ask the other members of the committee as to how effective that is. There is, I suppose, a little bit of a potential tension or trade-off, and it goes back to Tony King's question earlier, between a desire to maintain committee unity and consensus and the need sometimes to be challenging of government or of others that we're holding to account. And I'm aware of that potential tension, though to be honest we haven't yet had an issue that tests that.
Sarah?
Well, I'm the opposite. I'm a poacher-turned gamekeeper because I was a doctor for 24 years. And interestingly, 3 members of the committee are now doctors, and we have other members of the committee who have expertise in other areas related to health and social care. So I think that's important, but what you wouldn't want is, just as we heard about the problems of capture by outside organisations, if the committee was entirely captured by people who'd been working in the NHS, I think that would also be a problem, because you do need to have some people who've got lived experience. Lived experience as either a patient or a carer is absolutely as valuable. So I think you need a balance. But certainly when you've got a witness in front of you who's clearly talking rot, it's sometimes easier to spot that if you've done the job. So.
Great.
Well, one of the other main surprising things, as well as having all this wonderful staff that you get, is just how hard you have to work as a select committee chair, because we've got to know everything. I think that, like when you do get the brief and the suggested questions, you've got to know what's coming, and it's up to us to ensure that there's never going to be a lull in the proceedings. If anything looks like it's going to be dying away, it's up to us to pick that up and make sure the session continues and we get the best from the witnesses. And sometimes, like it's other members of our committee could come in and dip in, but we've got to be there concentrating and ensuring that our session, particularly the evidence sessions, are working well. I mean, as I said, I had no great expectation of being the select committee chair when I got the job. I looked round and observed others that I hugely respect as select committee chairs, and I was looking at Keith Vass particularly. Keith, I think, and also the work that's been done in the Treasury Select Committee. And I think as select committee chairs, you do develop your own style. I think I'm still developing it. And at some point you keep on evolving as a chair, and you do acquire different skills and things that are useful. The stuff that you might do which doesn't work, then you discard that and you pick up other things. So I think the job as a select committee chair is constantly changing, and you just find a means and a way which suits your own approach to the job, your own personality, and the way you do it.
Do you find yourself, as it were, exchanging tips at the liaison committee or some such forum? I tried that last year and it never worked.
Well, I don't know if I think you've not been to a liaison committee. I think that anything like that happens. And if we were all to all sort of hold hands and sing Kumbaya and how we're all doing it, I think the liaison committee would be a very interesting and probably very different place. But I think as a community of chairs, liaison committee is quite an interesting, and I don't know if there's any questions coming up about liaison committee, but there does seem to be, and we all know each other now a little bit, and the way that we do come together in liaison committee. I mean, I mischievously stood for the chair of the liaison committee, and I thought, why not? It was a place available, and and I was surprised I got a few votes, and then they made me vice convener of the liaison committee. So, this is the way that it sort of works, and there is a real collegiate approach from fellow chairs. Because I think that, we've all got quite a unique role, but there is a sort of community amongst the select committee chairs. It's perhaps not best expressed through the liaison committee, but I think there's a place for the liaison committee to start look at these things, how we could work together.
One specific skill we've had a question emailed about is how gender aware are the chairs and the committees in their operation? How far do you take account of women's inequalities and the needs of women as a group when you conduct inquiries? What sort of steps would you take to investigate service delivery and its effectiveness in relation to the needs of women from all sections of the community? This is from Marion Scott from the Women's Health and Equalities Consortium. So gender awareness there, I imagine that's a particular issue for the Health
I
Committee.
think what's interesting is the gender makeup of select committees themselves. So you see things like the Foreign Affairs Committee and the Defence Committee are very male-dominated committees, and so it's sort of these kinds of things continue. But of course, a lot of that is dependent on who actually applies for the roles. So yes, I mean, I think these things are important, and just being aware that they're there, so you don't ignore those very important issues. I think that's what you have to do.
I think it's really crucial. I mean, we're 6 men and 5 women, but within that, all 4 Labour members are men, slightly embarrassingly, whereas the Conservatives and the SNP provide us with the 5 women. I'm always very anxious when we're taking evidence that we have a mix and that we don't have all male panels, when we have a panel of people giving us evidence wherever possible. And as I mentioned earlier, our priorities for this Parliament are in line with the global goals adopted by the UN. Issues to do with gender, and in particular issues to do with violence against women and girls, will be absolutely at the heart of the priorities that we have. So, for example, when we do country visits to DFID recipient countries, issues to do with the position of women and girls in that country will always feature in those country visits.
Well, I suppose the question's point in a way is not just do you look at, in inverted commas, women's issues, but do you factor in the issue of gender to any general look at a service that you're doing?
Yes, yes.
Yeah, well, I think there's nothing worse when you're taking evidence and you've got a panel of people that are all men, and we do all we can to ensure that doesn't happen. When it comes to the make-up of select committees, you can only be responsible for your own party. And we've got 4 members of the Scottish Affairs Committee from the SNP. There's 2 men and 2 women. And I know is that one select committee, it's all male. Is it DCMS, which is all male, which is again is a feature about who's prepared to stand, come forward. And parties have to be conscious of this. When, particularly, I have to say to my larger party colleagues, that they've got the bulk of the membership on this committee, and they've got to be very careful about who they are nominated to be on it. And we take that very seriously in our party to ensure that there is that gender balance. We only get 1 member on all the committees, but I think we did everything that we could. I think most of our membership of select committees is actually female members that we offered and put forward as nominees for these committees.
Of course, by all means. So can we just get the mic to you? Thanks.
I am Marion Scott from
I hope I got your question fairly right.
I should have said Equality Consortium. I mean, I think the makeup of the panel, of the committee is important, but I don't think it's the end of the answer. We've got inequality in this country, and if we're looking at gender, if Stephen's committee can look at gender, I don't see why others can't.
Oh, we do. I mean,
and
so
in a systematic way, I think.
Yes.
So it's the systematic way that I was interested in.
Right, so in the last Parliament, for example, we held an inquiry into physical activity and health, and we very specifically wanted to look at the issues about exclusion for women. So we actually actively looked at that specifically to say how do we improve the access and participation in sport by women. So I think it's about recognising that there's an issue and making sure that you address it.
Could be a long debate.
But can I ask you perhaps a question as to how you would like to see committees do it?
Turn the tables.
No, but it's interesting because no, I'm in the hot seat and I've told you how we have tried to do it, for example, and given you a specific example. But what's interesting, I guess, for us is to say, what do you observe when you look at select committees and say that they should be doing differently to address that point?
Well, sometimes I wonder how you select your witnesses.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah.
I thought I had a loud voice. Sometimes I would wonder how you select your witnesses.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, in one area that you would have some responsibility for, I think, sexual violence, there's a big thing happening where the services locally are going to be very much undermined by new arrangements with commissioning and tendering. So if you don't ask the right questions, you're not going to get, of the right witnesses, you're not going to get the right kinds of answers. So it's very much about asking the right questions, and your specialists, your support workers need to be able to do that. You need to ask the right witnesses, you need to use the equalities specialists within the health system, and you need to not forget about gender, because there's lots of equalities talk that seems to not get to women. Somehow we're either too small a group or too big a group, and we don't really want to talk about it.
Thank you. It's a good point. And do you welcome the fact that we've now got a women and we've got an equalities select committee specifically looking at that?
Of course.
Thank you.
If you could, and the mic behind you there. Another question.
Sally Muggeridge. When I was running the Industry and Parliament Trust a few parliaments ago, it was always very difficult to get anybody to serve on the European Select Committee. Has interest now got more engendered?
Thank you, Sally. Well, that brings us very neatly, actually, onto a question we've got here from Robin Munro, one of the researchers here at the IFG, about how Select Committees should be dealing with EU policy and legislation. In other parliaments, subject committees, if you like, do take a much more active engagement in EU-related issues and EU directives and things like that in their particular area of expertise. So do the committees here represented plan to take a more active interest in EU-related matters and scrutinise them more than perhaps they have in the past? Sarah's nodding enthusiastically.
Well, yes, we've decided to appoint an EU rapporteur, because what we've realised is within committees, this is such a complex area. So we invited to see who within our committee would be interested to follow what's happening in the EU, and Andrea Jenkins has taken that on and will be liaising with the European Scrutiny Committee to see what issues are coming up in the European Parliament and what kinds of areas should we take an interest in. So yes, just to answer that point.
Is that a fashion that other committees are going to follow?
We were all encouraged to, and we put it on the agenda, and no one else volunteered, so I am the EU rapporteur for the International Development Committee, and I'm full of enthusiasm to be so. But seriously, a lot of the multilateral aid that the UK's funds is through the European Union, so in terms of DFID, it's actually really important that we have effective European scrutiny. And I met earlier this week with the MEP Linda McAvan, who chairs the European Parliament's Development Committee, to look at how we can work more effectively between the European Parliament and the UK Parliament on issues to do with international development.
We've got no plans to look at the European Union referendum, and it's not something that actually came up when we asked Scotland what they wanted from the Scottish Affairs Committee. I know most of the Select Committees seem to be doing a degree of work when it comes to the European Union referendum, and I think that as a committee we'll be bound to have a look at some of the issues as the impact on Scotland, because there are particular issues that we've got with the referendum in the work of the European Union and Commission. So I wouldn't be surprised at some point in the course of the next year, as Europe becomes an even hotter topic than it is, that all of us will be at least dipping into some of the issues as they pertain to our own select committees as we go forward.
A couple of questions on this list here about the way committees conduct their sessions, the Buggins' turn method, if you like, of going around and everybody getting a question. Is it an impediment, an irritation? Does it disrupt the free flow of things that everybody seems to have a go?
I think provided people are disciplined and well behaved, it's fine. And I mean that seriously. If there is a self-discipline about people when they've got their question and they might do a follow-up, not then hogging the questions for a long period of time at the expense of others, then it works. And so far, I would say on the oral evidence sessions we've had, it's worked perfectly fine.
Is it a problem you find, perhaps in your committee, you have to go around the table every time?
I think if people turn up to your committee, it's right that they participate. Exactly. And I think there's an expectation that everybody should at least ask some sort of question when they're there, because I don't think members of Parliament aren't the type of people who turn up and say nothing. So as long as we could distribute it equally and fairly and everybody gets a shot, I think that's the way to proceed. And I'm not actually detected any great difficulty in these type of arrangements. And we're in the chair, so if it seems like somebody's getting bogged down or refusing to move on, you can just quite easily, prompt them along to move on to the next question, the next session, and usually you get cooperation from colleagues around the table when it comes to these things. So I think it's right that it's equally distributed in a method that everybody understands and can buy into.
Sarah, I detected a benign smile during that.
Well, of course, people are enthusiastic and passionate about what they're asking, and so it is sometimes difficult, because there has to be a balance. Because we had our first session, it ran to nearly 5 hours, and we all decided after that we were not going to that we did have to have some discipline about restricting questioning, because people are genuinely interested, but but we do have to try and finish if we can in 2.5 hours. So that's the challenge that we face. I think what works best is if each members of the committee can develop a special interest in a certain area, so that as that topic comes up again and again, perhaps there's a member of the committee who's going to develop that theme and have a further background interest in it. So I think those kinds of things work well. And what doesn't work well is if somebody strays into questioning that we've agreed that somebody else is going to ask about. But you know, it happens sometimes.
A bit of poaching, I'm shocked. Can I then ask you about the other side of the coin, the witnesses? What makes a good witness? What makes a bad witness? And do feel free to anecdote. Go on, Steve.
Sarah said earlier, I think Sarah said earlier, sometimes the people who know most aren't always the best people to get their point across. And I think because time is very tight, and we certainly try in our committee to have a lot of witnesses to get a range of views. So I think there are two things that can be frustrating: an inability to be succinct in answers, so someone who basically answers it in the first minute and then elaborates for another 4 minutes. And also we tend to have panels of two or three witnesses. Sometimes the sense that everyone has to answer every question can be very, very frustrating. Now that partly is about the chair and being effective in the chair and saying, no, only you need to answer this one, we don't need all three of you to answer, particularly when they agree. It's all right if it's kind of disagreement, but where everyone's got to say the same thing, that can be a bit frustrating.
Sarah?
I've taken now to asking people, we try and do some exploratory work when we're going to hold an inquiry with people who have expertise in the field, and now taking to asking them who would they think would be the best person to put forward the view on this, because I say that sometimes the person who's got the greatest expertise might not be the best at communicating it. So it's having that combination, someone who's got genuine expertise but is also a great communicator.
Have you ever had anybody there and you're just desperate for them to actually say something in an answer that made sense to you? Have you had people sort of waffling away and not really generating any kind of clear...
Yes, that is difficult. Or you have some witnesses who are very dogmatic, certainly some former ministers who machine gun you with data and you know, things like that you don't necessarily want. You want people who can get that balance right.
I mean, your evidence sessions are purely dependent on your witnesses and your quality of your witnesses and the type of personalities they are. We had a particularly entertaining minister today, I'll just leave it hanging at that, in front of our committee, who was prepared to offer some individual views about some of the issues we're looking at. And that's great because, you know, you do get something back and something that you can positively engage with. But, you know, you can have this expectation, and you look at the list of witnesses and think, they're going to be brilliant, you know, you're going to get really good stuff out of them, and they turn up and they're as dull as dishwater, and you're doing all you can to try and stimulate some sort of interest and get the best out of them. And I think as chairs, you feel for the witnesses. I know sometimes you want to have a really good exchange where you can actually get underneath and find out what's going on and get some real quality evidence. But if somebody's dying in front of you, there's also this temptation, you want to help them in a system and make sure you do give them the opportunity to put forward their very clear views about what they want to share with you as the committee.
It's interesting, Jamie Oliver, when he came, used props. And you're not supposed to bring props, but he brought some anyway. And but actually, it was quite effective sometimes. So I think maybe select committees should be a bit more flexible.
More open to a bit of showmanship.
Yeah, a few more props. And
I think this... Oh, sorry, we have a questioner there. Just if you just take the mic.
Mary Dashevsky, I'm a journalist. Do you wish that, or think that you ought to have more power, for instance, to impeach ministers or fire civil servants?
Like that.
Oh. The power and the glory.
I mean, it's one of these things. I mean, I think we've all said this, and what's become a feature of the conversation we've been having is that the select committees are continuing to evolve. You know, I don't think the right process is a full stop on where select committees will be, and in 5 years, 10 years' time, we might actually be in that situation and position. You know, like I think that the way that select committees have been observed by the public, I think, has changed dramatically. And I think one of the things that sort of helped us was the big theatre sessions when the Murdochs visited Portcullis House, for example. I mean, select committees dominated the news, you know, what was happening in DCMS, some of the stuff that went on in Treasury Select Committee when they were looking at some of the banking crisis and whatever, I think again ensured that select committees continued to make the news. So I think there's maybe not getting ministers impeached or losing their job, but I think as we go down the line, there will be further responsibilities that select committees will do. Some of that will be done through a formal process where it will be agreed and passed by Parliament, but others will just be evolutionary. And I think that, you know, we're all sitting here in 5 years' time, and as I'm sure we all still will be chairing our select committees, we'll find that they're very much different beasts than they are just now.
We have another question from the floor there, Lord Howarth.
If it's not an abusive process, because I was late, I was voting in the House of Lords on votes at 16 in the referendum. I don't know, I hastened to come here. So
we'll check Twitter
other people probably know from social media. I'm just prompted by Mary Jessica's question on this matter of power. I mean, the crucial difference between Westminster select committees and congressional select committees or congressional committees in the USA is congressional committees have power over appropriations. They determine the budgets of departments. Now that seems unthinkable in our system. Is it a fantasy that any of you could entertain for the future?
You wake up at night wishing you had power to determine the NHS budget.
Just over the NHS, yes, I'd love to have power over the NHS budget, but if we were going to do so, of course, we'd need far greater support than we currently have. Within our current system, we know that would be unrealistic. But yes, I do think that what we do need is to have greater powers to call for people, persons and papers, you know, because too much is unreasonably withheld, I think. And if we're going to have a culture of more open government, that could start by more transparency when requested by select committees.
Can I offer a little bit of elaboration on that? Do you, for example, think that perhaps select committees, particularly ones scrutinising a particular department, should take a bit more of a look at their budget, even if they can't go through it line by line, should perhaps have a look at, are the spending priorities right?
Yes.
For example.
Yes, I think that there's definitely a case, and particularly, for, as you say, in terms of regaining the public's confidence in what your budget is spent on. I think it would be a very good thing for you to have more powers. And yes, certainly from my point of view, I'd love to have a greater influence on how the funding was distributed. But I think without additional support, I think that would be unrealistic.
And would you perhaps, and I'll pass this all to the three of you, perhaps like to have more power to block the appointment of key quangocrats in your particular sphere? Stephen.
Can I answer the other question?
Sure.
I'm getting ahead of myself. We are about to conduct an inquiry looking at DFID's allocation of resources in the light of the Comprehensive Spending Review. And I mentioned we have this body ICAI that will work closely with us on it. I think it has made the department a little nervous that we're going to do this. Precisely how much influence we will then have, I've no idea. But at the end of that process, I might have a fuller answer in terms of whether we do need more of the sort of power that Alan was referring to. I think in principle, the idea of select committees having a bigger say in terms of giving approval to certain key Quango appointments is absolutely right. I think in principle, yes.
Well, there's very little disagree about that. I think the select committee should, of course, have a role when it comes to these type of appointments, particularly when we're so close to a subject area and there's a huge piece of expertise available in order to help make the right decisions about these sort of things. I think Alan's point is really good, and I think we all look enviously at the United States, and you know, when we all imagine that we're going to be, you know, like senators on these all-powerful congressional committees that seem to just, you know, like dominate the whole of the infrastructure in the capital. But I think that the right reforms started by looking internationally at what was going on, in particularly America, and we are catching up bit by bit. Do I think we'll ever be like the United States? No, I don't. I don't think our political culture could quite accommodate committees of that type of stature and nature. But what I think we'll see as we go forward is us securing more powers, and I think we'll have a great deal more of authority in how we'll look after and monitor our departments.
I think there's a greater scope as well for governments. asking the committee for their advice, particularly if they become increasingly comprised of people who do have expertise from previous experience. And so I would think that one of the weakest areas in Parliament at the moment is the scrutiny within secondary legislation. I mean, delegated legislation committees are appalling. It was the thing that most shocked me when I arrived, because I found myself stuck on a DL committee looking at double taxation in Oman. And I passed a note to the whip to say, because I thought it must be a mistake, and I was told that my role was to turn up, say nothing, turn up on time, say nothing, and vote with the government. Wow. And that is the effect, that is what happens. And I may find myself looking at some complex tax legislation when down the corridor there's somebody else who's a tax lawyer looking at healthcare. I know, and there seems to be no arrangement for allowing MPs to choose DL committees in which they can contribute meaningful scrutiny. And I think that's outrageous. And so I think if that system can't change, which I think it should, and there's no excuse for not doing it, I think that perhaps governments could pass some of this legislation through a select committee to ask them to comment, so that we get meaningful scrutiny. I think that would be very helpful.
I think I've got what may turn out now to be our last question, because I think our hour through the ringer is coming to an end. But this is one from Jill Rutter, Programme Director here at the IFG. Quote, "An MP friend of mine told me there was a clear line from the whips to vote for ineffective opposition candidates for chairmanships of key committees." Can this possibly be true? And does it risk bringing the whole committee system into disrepute? And what can be done to save select committees from the whips? Now, who'd like to have a go at this?
I thought the process of the election of the chairs this time around was absolutely fantastic. I mean, I was everybody's best friend, because all of a sudden the Scottish National Party had 56 votes, which was available. And so, as one of the older members, you know, like they didn't know any of the new guys, I was courted. I could barely move across Portcullis House without being besieged by all sorts of candidates for all various sorts of select committees. And I just thought, as a democratic exercise, it was actually really good and really interesting. And people made such efforts to try and secure the chair of some of these committees. There was all sorts of strange literature that was being produced, some very innovative. And if they spend as much time like developing their committee, it'll be fantastic. But I'd have to say, I know it was a bit of a mischievous question, but I didn't sort of detect there was any sort of dark games going on when it came to select committee chairs. I think that the House demonstrated this opportunity very, very diligently, and I think that they looked who was available, and I think the best people definitely got the job. Certainly, with my colleagues here, most definitely have that.
Well, Sarah, can I suggest to you, because this is an alternative interpretation of this process that was put to me by a number of people on the government side, that the Labour Party particularly urged its members consciously to vote for the candidate for a Conservative allocated select committee seat who would cause the most trouble to the government. And thus you and indeed Rory Stewart became committee chairs, it is argued.
Well, actually, no, in a sense, this time round they had a choice between myself and David Tredynick. Now, David Tredynick has a very keen interest in alternative medicine, so I think that the choice was whether, you know, was between someone who really does feel that we need to go down promoting complementary therapies within the NHS, and somebody who, you know, looks at a more evidence-based approach, perhaps. But that was.
I'm not sure that perhaps was needed.
But I think what's important is that you give people a clear choice. I don't think I would have been the whip's first choice to be select committee chair, if I'm honest with myself. But I think that it is important that people have a choice. And I think from the only thing I would say about the SNP process was the choice made within the party internally, and there wasn't an election for the SNP chairs. And I hope next time round, although of course I absolutely think that both of you are doing a fantastic job, and this isn't a criticism at all. I would say that the process, I think, would have been stronger if all chairs had been elected. So I don't think we should have a sort of a coronation. I think we should have a fair process that applies to all parties.
If I can, if it's helpful, I mean, there was only 6 of us are in a position really to take up a chairmanship of
Yes.
a select committee, because 50 of them were brand new, and we felt it would probably not be appropriate to offer people who nobody knew anything about at all a select. And I can assure you that next time round there will be an open, because you'll all know these people now. But in the past, there were only 6 of us that were familiar to you.
It was an extraordinary process, and it reminded me a bit of student politics in terms of particularly some of the materials that Pete was referring to, that we were all having sort of shoved under our doors, encouraging us to vote for different candidates in the chair election. It all happened very quickly, didn't it, with a lot of different elections happening at the same time. And because it's rightly at the beginning of the Parliament, a lot of people are new, so there's a process as candidates getting to know new people. I was struck, without naming any names, 1 or 2 colleagues, I think, spoke to me for the first time, asking me for my vote for them in committee elections. So I think you're rewarded if you're generally getting on with people, not just getting on with people during the period of the election. I think the whips will always have a view on these things, but my sense, in answer to Jill's question, is that by and large most MPs on this weren't taking a view from the whips, even if there was one, and were forming a view based on policy or based on performance or likability of candidates.
We have a question from the floor here, sir. Can we
just turn my mic off?
I think we're armed and dangerous.
Right, thanks very much. I'd like to have 1 or 2 answers to the question of elections, so I don't confuse myself, never mind my students. First of all, with respect to the committee chairs, who is it that decides how many should be Labour, how many should be Conservative, SNP, what have you? Is that still in the hands? Of the whips? Was it a case that whatever happened, whoever was going to be in charge of international development was going to be Labour, and health was going to be Conservative?
We're in the presence of 2 former inhabitants of the usual channels here, so
so it's basically, John, broadly proportional. So the Conservatives get the largest number, then Labour, then SNP as the third party, and that's generally reflected in the memberships of the committees themselves, apart from Scottish Affairs, as we've heard. Yes, it is the usual channels, the whips, that determine which party gets which. Some, by convention, go with the government party or the opposition party. So public accounts is always opposition, for example, and I think Treasury and Foreign Affairs seems generally to go with government by convention.
And following that up, the actual electorate, because I presume, am I right, but the front bench should be excluded?
No, all MPs.
All MPs, right. And then, so all MPs, but when it comes to the ordinary members, presumably that is, so many Conservatives, so many Labour.
And that's done within the parties. So the Labour members of the International Development Committee are chosen by the Parliamentary Labour Party. And I'm trying to remember, I think that, I can't remember actually whether that's all the PLP or just backbenchers. I can't actually remember. I think probably just backbenchers, but don't quote me because I'm not that wrong.
But one final question, and it's quite simply this. Is it simply first past the post? Because let's just suppose that there are several aspirants to the select committee. Is it simple first past the post?
Alternative vote.
Do they have to alternative vote?
Alternative vote.
Thanks very much.
Hannah.
Go on then, let's indulge Hannah, who's...
I just can't resist to follow up on that. So we were talking earlier about the different gender makeup of committees, and Sarah made the point that it depends who stands, who gets onto committees. But obviously, at the moment, committee members are elected by parties privately, and it's not a transparent process. And so nobody knows who stood for your committee, Sarah, and whether it was only women who stood, and so on. Do you think there's a case for parties being more open about the process of electing their members onto select committees?
It certainly saved the problem of people telling everyone that they voted for them. So
any more for any more? I think we'd have to wind up in a moment, but well, it only remains for me to thank our 3 guests today, Pete Wishart, Sarah Willison, Stephen Twigg. A very entertaining hour. It's been an absolute pleasure to sit here and listen to this, and I've learned a lot. I hope everybody else has too. Thank you very much indeed. And I believe chalk ices are now on sale in the foyer.